Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
If you're all ready, I think we're ready as well. My name is Harold Javid, and on behalf of Microsoft Research, I would like to welcome you all to the part of this event, which is the workshop, which we have put on in co-location with the actual IEEE conference. Historically, we've had an Microsoft eScience workshop every year for the last 7 years, and we thought, and in Indianapolis, we partnered up with the IEEE eScience conference, and we thought it would be very interesting here to try to tie it even more closely together, so you see our sessions are overlapping with the sessions of the conference, and we really want to express our appreciation to the eScience community within the IEEE for welcoming us, for allowing us to go ahead and do this. So we're very happy to be here. And to kick off our activity today, we have a very exciting plenary keynote session. Dan Fay is, in my mind, the ideal person to open this event with his discussion on the topic of advancing environmental understanding. It's an area that he's been working on in many years, and in some ways he's really been thinking about this before a lot of us were thinking about it. We have been working it in various areas, but Dan really is the one who's done really the leading work. And he's the leader of the eScience activities within Microsoft Research from the standpoint of reaching out into the community and finding out how we can be more effective together as partners. So with that, Dan, I'd like to welcome you.
Thanks. So, thank you, and thanks, Harold, and everyone for allowing me to speak. I'm not sure about it being an exciting speaker, but with this headset on, I do feel like I should be, Britney Spears or some motivational speaker up here for you. So, hopefully, it'll come off that way. The other thing, when we all look at the agenda today, and as Mark reminded me, it's an hour-and-a-half slot, so I figure I will speak for 90 minutes. No, actually not. So there'll be plenty of time for questions and then also a break. So please don't feel like you're in for a long, long lecture. So one of the things I wanted to do today, this morning, and kind of Harold talked about, was looking back at some of the eScience and looking back at how we've learned from it and some of the environmental activities we've been involved with. So one of the things I decided to do was look back 8 years ago when we actually first started what became the Microsoft Research eScience Workshop. The original one we called the Scientific Data Intensive Computing Workshop. It was the one before the first eScience workshop we hosted. And one of the key things out of that workshop was hosted by, the keynote there was by Jim Gray, so I definitely do not feel like I'm following in his footsteps on this, but wanted to highlight some of Jim's talks, but like any good keynote, the talk title that was listed on the original invitation, of course, he changed and ended up being The Online Science, the New Computational Science, and really went into some of the ways that the internet and how online science would actually change how we are all doing computing and computational science. Also, that was quite interesting, one of the other talks as I was going back through looking at them, and of course one of the great things about the internet nowadays is that most of this material is still up there, is going back and looking at the agenda and the participants. And we also had a talk at that time by Alex Saleh, who here is as well, and so it's great actually to see kind of that continuation and some of the people still being involved with this field. And at that time, Alex was still kind of more on the pure astronomy side, still kind of pushing how we can use technology in that space, and now is kind of also morphed into more of the eScience space. So looking back still, out of Jim's talk, his original talk from that workshop, I wanted to actually look at it and see some of the things he talked about and how they've changed, how we seem to be still dealing with those even after 8 years. We're still dealing with some of these challenges. So, you know, the information avalanche, the data deluge, you know, there's many different terms for this. We still are kind of talking about that, and we still feel like we don't have a good answer for those issues. Jim also talked about a lot of the publishing of data and how that was actually changing from, I know it's kind of hard for folks to see maybe, but up here from the authors, you know, changing and how you're merging with collaborations and larger papers. And data needs to be cross-referenced with the literature and the metadata. There was a lot of discussion also at that workshop about the global federations, how data sets needed to be local because you wanted them to be maintained by the people that could curate it and actually had an ownership of the data and keep investing in those data sets, but be able to link across those. And one of the key things as well was this kind of what is the end of the different sciences, the informatics and the different sciences need from computer science. And this idea that you have scientists, you have the miners, people that are actually going to actually dive into the data, analysis, look at it, new algorithms, the plumbers, people actually creating the databases and the infrastructure to handle some of that, and then people creating the tools to help question and help folks answer some of the questions that they have. And then he even had presented how to help and kind of this call to action and what some of the great CS research problems are, which we still talk about today: modeling, analysis, visualization, and the overall systems architecture to build these overall systems. So I think in part of the looking back is we've seen that there's been changes. There's a lot of technology that's been created and applied, and now how do we actually utilize this in the benefit for science? And we still need to make sure that it becomes tangible and becomes part of the infrastructure for folks doing the science to make it much easier. So as I mentioned, you know, we're still dealing with this. These are, you know, papers and topics that are in modern press and everything on the scientific deluge of data. There's also been some interesting books kind of coming out on talking about the nature of technology, Brian Arthur's book, on how actually technology evolves and the commoditization of different pieces of it and how that brings together. Stuart Brand's book talking about the whole earth discipline and the challenges with things like urbanization and how we need to adopt technology to these new areas and these new emerging markets, but also that we need to be realistic in these areas and understand the challenges with climate and environmental impact that these larger cities are going to have, especially the ones that we've known about that have been the top 10 cities will be changing over the next 10 years. And so how does all that play together? There's also been some interesting book coming out of work out of the Michael's book on reinventing discovery and how social networks and social engineering and also citizen science can be applied to science problems. One of the pieces that was kind of highlighted was some of the work that came out of the Sky Query work and some of the Sloan Digital Sky Server work, making that available for not only astronomers, but then when it was made for the general public through things like Galaxy Zoo, how that helped and how you could have everyday scientists use the same data sets. So kind of an interesting way of bringing together how do we extend out the community, how do we change how science is done, and this whole idea of kind of network science. We need to start thinking about that more and including it within the overall, I'll say, eScience methodology, and not just limited it to say, yeah, it's great for them to do, but it won't work in our space. I think there needs to be a way of thinking from the beginning, how can we incorporate other folks into some of these areas and looking at different data sets. So this is one of the slides that actually also came from Jim, talking about the emergence of the fourth paradigm, but really going through that whole changes from experimental to theoretical to computational and now to this kind of data intensive, and this area of, we're having more information, how do we deal with it, how do we analyze it, and how do we make sense of it and actually combine it with other data sets together. So some of the key things we look at in the area of kind of eScience and what I've been seeing over the last number of years is how do we help make analysis, data mining, federation of data sets, all those pieces easier for the scientists to take advantage of. So one of the key things is not that technology is the answer, but technology helps with those answers and putting the infrastructure in place. And one of the things we always have to keep coming back to is making sure we find the right technology that solves the problems. So the fourth paradigm was kind of put together a lot of these topics together into this book that we released a number of years ago. Some of the authors are here as well, the contributing authors. And so it really helped focus a lot of the thinking that we had and some of the thinking that came out of Jim's early work on how we could bring together these different types of groups and some of the challenges that we still have ahead of us. And so the generic problem that we think about when we look at what eScientists do in the whole area of eScience is how do we bring together all these different data sets, information, the literature searches, the gray kind of archives, the PowerPoints, the PDFs, the notes. How do you bring those together, and how can someone ask essentially questions to it and find some sort of information out of that? And there are these generic problems that we've been talking about for a number of years, and the challenge has been sometimes we try to solve it on the whole, and rather than just solving it for an area and keep working and making that more generic. And we in our area look at in specific areas of visualization and data management, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But these are some of the things that have still been going on and we still have to wrestle with. And how can we make this easier? One of the nice parts of kind of the fourth paradigm piece, there was a publication just last month by Jeff Dozier on mountain hydrology, snow color, and the fourth paradigm that came out in EOS, and talking about how this change has happened, how you bring together a lot of these data sets in their space, and highlighting some of those changes that involve. So it's starting to percolate within some of the different disciplines as well. And you start actually having data sets from not only the ground-based ones that Jeff also deals with, but also the satellite ones, the modeling information that they take together, combining all those together to get some sort of insight of what's happening. One of the other things that's really clear is that over the last number of years, it's not just the raw data that's important. The raw data is important, but the value of the data becomes actually more valuable as you go up this ladder. So as it becomes processed and actually becomes more scientific ready, the value of that data is actually not only more helpful, but also more valuable for others to actually use. And so it's important to actually have folks that do really good job in the integration, the analysis, and creating higher level services of that information for others to use. We can all get to, a lot of times, the raw data sets, say from NASA or from other folks, but to get it in a scientific ready format that someone can take and use right away, rather than burning grad student hours, converting that into a format, is valuable. And if we think of the time versus money argument, it can be very useful. So how do we actually value that, and how do we put a reward system in place to actually make this a important piece of the overall scientific space, and reward folks for doing that well? And that's something we look at, but we also think that the community as a whole needs to start thinking about and valuing. Because you actually start doing better research when you start using data sets that have already been utilized or have been processed. One of the other things that's kind of come out of some of the work we've been looking at and the groups we've been working with is this, what we call an environmental ecosystem. and looking at how the whole area works together, or how it should work together. So overall, you end up having information, knowledge coming from the basic Earth, from measurements and some of those things that we have. You have folks that want to take some sort of action in the case of either climate change or some sort of ecosystem management, and you want to actually transfer some of the knowledge and have the information about the current system, the Earth, the way it's working, inform the actions of the policymakers and others, as well as vice versa, inform their thinking. And so within these spaces, we kind of dived into it more, and this is, as you look at it, it's kind of commonplace what you might be used to within these areas. But you end up having the data, and what I'll say is that the left-hand side is the scientific side that happens a lot. You have the data, the acquisition, the management, the analysis. You end up having some sort of work being done on that. And then at some point you have this one human piece that happens, which is insight. Insight doesn't happen by any of the technologies. It happens by the actual human looking at the information and gaining some other understanding of it. And then you end up taking that insight and you actually write it into a paper, usually, or into a talk, but the paper with the data, and you publish it, and it keeps going around in that circle. So it gets informed at a conference or through a publication in a journal. But for that really to have actually an impact on the action side, so either on the policymakers, the general public, companies, others, there needs to be a communication method for actually getting that information in a form that they can actually pull from and understand. And once they can actually understand it, they can communicate it more broadly to their constituents and others. They can just make some sort of decision. Again, another human piece that happens. They make a decision on that information, and then they actually will do some sort of implementation to make sure that that decision happens. But that all implementation and that decision needs to then be reintroduced back into the scientific side to make sure that it actually validates and happens. Well, if you look at this, this is what happens anyways. This could all be done on paper, but technology can actually help this and actually make it more streamlined. One of the things it can do is help with the credibility of the actual information here on the left-hand side when the decision makers and the policymakers can actually dig back into the data. So one of the things we've seen is that policymakers having the ability to go back in increases the credibility of those data sets. And so finding the right way to communicate that information to them in the way that they can understand it, again, that's a key thing, not just handing them a publication, but there needs to be an understanding of that publication in a way that they can consume it. So that's where a lot of the technology can kind of come in and help with that, both sides of it. And we've seen this in areas where you've actually taken data sets and used the same data sets for both the general public and for the scientific side, but maybe presented it a little differently or created different interfaces into that data set. It makes a big impact. People actually feel like they're dealing with the real thing, not just with some simulation. But the other part that's hard to sometimes understand is that knowledge side and that action side have many pieces that are interconnected. Policymakers get hit with this information from all sorts of different scientists, different groups, different organizations, and so how do you actually make sure that the message gets across and heard? So there's also decisions that have to be made sometimes on the policy side that take into account other things like economic interests and other types of areas that can affect their constituents. One quick example that you could look at is, if we really all wanted to make a big change on climate change and carbon emissions especially, we'd ban driving. Well, that's not going to actually happen because we all need it for different ways of transporting materials and people and things. So those decisions have to be balanced. But being able to have the policymakers have informed decisions based on scientific information is good. So when we've been working with different projects over the last number of years, these are some of the things that we've come up with that we've kind of noticed. This is some of the work also out of from Catherine Van Eegen that we used. So the whole ecological data flood, many different data sets coming together, and we're at this perfect storm of data, pulling it all together and trying to find the needle in all those kind of mushed together haystacks of information. So how do you find out that signal within all that information, the one that will actually create that insight that you can communicate to others? And so there needs to be ways of understanding, and the last thing you want is every scientist to understand every single file format out there of all these different data types. You actually want ways to just deal with the information and feel good and about that information and that it's useful. The other challenge we see is, data comes in all shapes, sizes, and how do you start pulling all these together from historical information, from historical photos, to model outputs, to levels that have different precision on them, from everything from these automated measurements that have happened over years, and as the devices have changed, you have different precision on those, from collections that are made from samples actually out in the field, and bringing all these together. And then the whole integration piece. Everything from, time, temporal data at different time scales, spatial variability, all this information needs to come together in a way that can both scientifically be validated, account for the uncertainties in there, and also be useful for the scientists. So one of the things that came out of one of the projects was we were working with scientists looking at satellite information and data, and it didn't seem to make sense to have to take this data from NASA, have them essentially become computer scientists to handle all the retiling of the information. So not only to handle finding the right tiles, but handling the reprojection in the format that they could deal with to pull out for just the area that they wanted to deal with. So in this case, it was California, dealing with data sets over 30 years. How do you start pulling that information out? How do you find it? How do you pull it out? And then actually how do you do something with the data? The run-up to just actually trying to do anything scientifically valid with the data takes a while. So, why kind of talk about this and why bring these up? We all kind of feel like we know these are issues. Because really the key thing is that the science happens when you start bringing all these together and when you can start mashing up these different data sets from the different levels and account for those, the uncertainties and the data types from across all those. So key things that we kind of look at is how would you make that easier? How do you actually look at bringing some of the information across, not only the provenance of it, but also the scale of it, and how do you do it in an easy manner that actually still feels like it still should have some scientific valid information on it. And how do we not make scientists, computer scientists? So I mentioned the project that we were looking at with the retiling. So we had this project using cloud services called Azure Modus, taking Modus data sets, pulling it in, retiling it, pulling out some of the information that we needed from the Modus data sets, especially the evapotranspiration and some of these variables that were needed, run it over a 10-year period, and try to get it as be able to look at that over that time scale. We only wanted to do it for California, and so having to pull those together, pull them out of the NASA data sets, reproject those, all those, just the cataloging of the tiles, where they were, which ones had cloud-free days, which ones didn't, all those we had to do from the base up. And really what we were just trying to do is get that in the hands of one scientist who originally started this as on one PC, and there was no way he could ever scale it. And so we started looking at how we could use cloud technology to help with this, and so in this case we used Azure. And Catherine and Marty, who's here as well, ended up putting together this system to make this available. And it changed actually the way that Young Rill could actually do the work and the science by having access to a lot more information and being able to handle this pipeline once it was kind of in place. So the potential of actually having access to this data for more scientists would be great. But the real key issue is, how does the scientist do this without having to have a huge computer science team behind them? So in this case, one scientist, and we had essentially 4 computer scientists working on this to help support that. So how do we actually turn it around and have it more of a 4-to-1 rather than a 1-to-4? We've also been looking at a lot of things on things like micrometeorology. How do you bring in sensor data in remote areas, in this case in Brazil, bring those together and actually deal with the real environmental challenges, everything from rain and animals chewing on cables to dealing with gap filling and different data issues, but getting a better understanding of a small area and within the canopy of a forest, understanding the whole dynamics of those spaces. So how do you deal with on a small and then incorporate it into the large area of the whole forest? And so we've been looking at this, understanding how you move the data around, how you clean it, how you parse it, and try to analyze it. We've been also looking at things like the biogeochemistry space, taking ocean-based data, how do we analyze that information, but also work with the scientists to visualize it and do better analysis on it and present it in a way that they can actually start digging into it and interpreting it in different ways. So there's many different sensors of information that they're pulling together. How do we pull this all together and allow them to manipulate it and play with it in different ways? And so we've been looking at everything from the visualizations of it to, once you have the visualization, how do you get back to the data and do different analysis on it as well? So one of the things that came out of a lot of this work that we look at is 3 key things that I always kind of keep hammering on when I work with our team and also with others, is this idea of discoverability, accessibility, and consumability of data. Discoverability is, can I find it? Do I know that it's there? Do I know what it is? Accessibility, can I actually get to it? And that means, even everything from basic FTP to, it's on a website, but do I have permissions to get to it? How do I get to it? And one of the key things also is consumability. Once I can get to it, can I actually do anything with it? There's a lot of data out there that, unless you can actually have the Rosetta Stone on interpreting it, it's very little you can do with it. So unless you actually have all 3 of these, the data might as well be locked away in a file cabinet and be no better than it was when we had it in paper form or others. So how do we actually help with some of this and actually make data much more accessible, discoverable, and consumable? So we've been also looking at that and looking at, where are there technologies both coming from internally from our research side to others, but also from our product side, and can we look at some of those and help with that? And so one of the things we also looked at was, are there ways to bring this together? And we've started kind of working on this thing, what we call the environmental informatics framework. Can we help with some of these data issues of pulling data from different sources together and actually do it in a way that just works, that we're not waiting for the long-term solution? It may not have everything, but it actually works now. And can we share it out, and can we help with some of these challenges? And so really, what we want to be able to do is have different applications, be able to get to all these different data sources, have it on different areas such as cloud services, clusters, databases, and others. And right now, it seems to just be a web of applications. If you actually want to write an application, you have to write it to many different APIs and pull it in. And while we have a lot of data that's available, Most of it is still available through a web-based type interface, and so you're limited again by the way the data producer is allowing you to have access to that information, usually in a kind of scripted, here's the way you get into it. So are there other ways to do this? So we've been looking at some of the work that came out of the, on the commercial side, so the Open Data Protocol, as a way to actually help facilitate that, because at least you get type information, you get a REST-based interface into it. It's built off of some of standard interfaces, so using some of the Atom services and some of the others. It doesn't solve everything, but you know what it does do? It actually allows you to have access to the information and allows the human still to interpret the information to say, yeah, this is this field, and yeah, I know this is a pressure, and it's of this value, and it's in this type, and actually do something with it. So it's a step up from dealing with CSV files and actually allow you to consume it and actually pull it into tools and start doing some analysis. So yeah, it doesn't automate everything for you, but at least gives you a way to get to that information and start dealing with it. And now with them starting to add in some of the geospatial support, it also adds in ability to do some of the spatial queries and some of the other ones that are needed in some of the environmental spaces we deal with. So again, it's more, I take a pragmatic view on sometimes on these things. How do we go from working to working and actually start providing solution for scientists and not wait 3-5 years for the final solution to actually be there and be available? And so we've actually been doing this with some different projects, starting to look at it, how we can make these available using different tool sets. We've been doing some through, this was in the case, Pivot Viewer, allowing Pivot, the viewer, to pull from data sets, visualize information. We've been looking at it from some of the stuff that we've been doing with worldwide telescopes and the visualizations in that space and others. And we're looking to see how does this work in those spaces, and can it provide quicker, easier access to the information and for the scientists to start doing work. The other thing we've been looking at is, from our product side, there's been some work we call, they're calling it Data Explorer, and it's from our SQL Azure team, but as a way to actually handle some of this. So discover, when they call it discover, enrich, and publish the information. Take data from many different data sets, start being able to actually do some of the key things that you need to do, like, let me get through this one, pull together these different data sets and actually start with the acquiring and dealing with the trust levels, the changes of it, and having a process in place to deal with that information and publish it out. So can I take many different data sets together? Not just mash them up, but can I actually fundamentally sometimes change those, process those, and then publish it out for someone else to be able to consume? So when I talked about earlier, the value of the data is actually, as you start providing services on top of it and processing it, how do we help make that easier for people to do that and make that available and allow others to consume it? So what they look at is, can you actually do some of the cleaning and some of the pulling together these different data sets and transforming it, either snapshot it, publish it out in things like JSON or OData, or even as CSV if you really want to, but actually make it available. And are there other ways, and there are possible business models for some of these to make subsidize the cost of actually those services running and some of the others. So again, how do you actually make a sustainable type system out of some of these data sets? So we're looking at those as well to go, how would this work within some of the scientific spaces, and can we actually utilize some of these same data sets and tools? We also have some projects that are going on out of our Microsoft Research Cambridge lab at our computational science team, things like Fetch Climate to, again, make it easier to get some of these climate data and actually process that as well. And so there's, want to make that easy for, at a click of a button, be able to actually pull down data sets and start being able to analyze those as well. So we have a number of these different pieces that are going on. How do we bring these all together and start making it easier for the scientists to deal with it? And it's cut off here, but if you go to fetchclimate.com, cloudapp.net. There's actually a working version of it. Kind of finish up on the data side. One of the things I also look at is, are we in this data tsunami or the avalanche of data, or do we have the opposite as well happening, which is the overall data hoarding, people actually having a lot of data, not making it available, or essentially because they're not publishing it or publishing it in ways that can be consumed, it's, again, in a file cabinet or just not available at all. And so how can we actually make those data sets much more usable by others? And I'll talk about some of the other challenges at the end real quickly as well, I see, with how you deal with this. One of the other things we'll look at a lot is new ways to analyze and communicate the data. So when I talked about in the ecosystem model, the whole issue of how do you communicate it to others, how can you do that in a way that makes sense in the way that they deal with it? And if you look at modern technology and where we are today, publishing a paper may not be the best way to communicate your scientific understanding to others. It still should be done, but we also need other ways of communicating that information to others and to the general public and to policymakers as well. There's a project going on. It'll be announced more widely next week, but the Eye on Earth Network, we've been working with the EEA, so the European Environmental Agency, and my colleagues here in Europe, on actually this project called Eye on Earth to make some of these data sets more available and actually have citizens actually be able to put other input in. And then now with Esri, there's going to be ways of actually publishing up this data from different countries and making it available to their citizens and actually having the citizens put input into it. So there's these, they have this notion of watches, noise watch, air watch, water quality watch, and these will be ways to actually have it available to citizens throughout the world. There's another project out of our Cambridge group, our computational science, Feldspach, looking at how you bring together Bayesian networks and others to actually start analyzing data sets. So we're looking at different ways, again, of analyzing data, how you can actually gain insight out of the data, and again, provide tools for scientists to actually look at not just look at it, but analyze the information and gain some sort of insight out of it. Untangled Bank is another project out of our environmental science group and the Cambridge lab. Again, putting the information into the cloud and being able to upload, search, relate, retrieve, and share, collaborate against that data sets as well. So one of the things we look across within Microsoft is how do you start doing this? How do you use these technologies, cloud, computing, analysis, algorithms, but put them together in a way that actually puts it into the hands and the language of the scientists directly. One other technology I've been really interested in lately, and this kind of a little digression, is this whole complex event processing. And so there's, you see this a lot more on the financial side. Not that the financial industry is a great example of how you run an industry, but how do you deal with event-driven computations? How do you actually track information and reason about time and some of the looking at multiple parameters over temporal areas? But can you process lots of this data, and can you deal with data that's not in, I'll say, ready for databases? So in data sets that could be, you might want to ask questions about, but actually process against it as well, and especially if it's streaming. And so one of our projects that came out of Microsoft Research, it was Orinoco, and then it became this project called Stream Insight, is a way to actually look at data streams and look at it, especially temporal nature, data streams of temporal nature, and start looking at it as it's going by and looking for things happening within that stream. So the easiest example that, that they use, and it's a good way to understand it, is how do you count the number of red cars going by on a freeway? If you use a database to do it, you'd have to try to put them all in, have an index for red cars, and you'd have to try to do a query across it against all the different cars going by. If instead you use something like event processing, you're looking at a window, counting the amount of cars, red cars that happen to go by on that stream, and correlating it maybe to other information. So the interesting part about something like this complex event processing and the tools that are in there is it can be used against any types of data sets. So you're looking at streams of information, and you could look at gradient changes happening. I want to know the temperature changing by 5 degrees over a 1 minute window and correlate that with the salinity going down, plus or minus 2 minutes, right? Some of these nondescript kind of questions where you want the precision may not be directly in there, and you can open up your time window to different pieces. So it ends up becoming a very interesting piece when there. Also, it not only works against live streaming data, but you can go against historical information as well in files. So you could think of this as an advanced grep system where you're actually sending the query to the individual data set, having it execute on it, and what you're doing, we were talking about this yesterday in some of these areas, and one of the discussions we've had for many years, which is how do you move the computation to the data? So the challenge has been over the last 20 years is that everyone moves the data to the computation because the cluster or the local machine is the thing where you do all the processing. So can you instead move a query to the file and actually have it just run there? So you're essentially cutting down the latency by moving the data from disk to this quick processing and back off again. And then just sending the events off of that, or just the data stream from there to something else to trigger another processing. So we've been looking at how you can do this with some of the scientific information. And we think that there's applicability, especially for large historical sets of data that might be sitting in things like NetCDF or HDF or any of these other data types that happen to deal with large amounts of binary type data sets in a temporal fashion. So one of the kind of the last piece when we deal with data, we also deal with how do you deal with the data and how do you find information out of it. And so we look at this notion of kind of visualize, explore, and discover. There's work we've been doing out of our Cambridge lab, this data set viewer that's should be now available or is available off of the Codeplex, sds.codeplex.com, that people can use. And it's a way to actually view different data sets and start being able to manipulate those in 2D and start looking at those. So we want, how do you, again, communicate it? We look at another project which is looking at networked graph information. So we have this project NodeXL that's been around for a number of years, which was originally aimed at social data. And we actually have plugins within Excel to actually pull data from Facebook, from Twitter, from your email. And so you can start analyzing the social graph of your connections and find out, interesting things like, who has the high degree or who has the betweenness between people, who's the sink, the source of the different types of data sets. But the interesting piece on a lot of this is the same idea of using it for social can also be used for many other types of data sets. There's a lot of different, everything from protein interaction to other ones where you end up having network graphs, and how do you start visualizing those? And can we start visualizing it with other data sets as well? And part of the key thing is how do we put this easy into the hands of people so they're not actually having to spend a lot of time either writing code or programming against it, but can they get the data in, start analyzing it, and start playing with it? Because you gain insight by actually exploring the data and playing with it, and that's where you actually get those aha moments. For our end, we've been doing a lot with Worldwide Telescope over the last number of years, looking at visualizations of different data sets. And one of the key things that came out of Worldwide Telescope was not only the access to lots of data sets and not even caring where they're located. So again, I want to just have something that I can manipulate, essentially a multimedia browser that allows me access to a large amount of data sets. But one of the key pieces and the learnings we came out of this was this tour concept, a way to communicate ideas or a tour of the information about that the author could put in and talk about in their own words. And how could they actually do that and make it available to others? So when I talked about earlier about that communication method, using the same scientific information, this is one of the ways we've been looking at it, and we see this is a possibility for others in other areas of how you can actually communicate ideas and have authors talk about their data and their information. So we think this multimedia way of going through data sets is a good thing to do. And the thing we want to have happen is, instead of it just being a video, which is what most people end up doing, you create a video which is a linear progression through the information, is have things where you can have a tour of the information and be able to stop and start and go into detail on it. And we've extended that to looking at Earth-based data sets, try to make it, again, much easier by having Excel and add-in in there to actually be able to publish data and be able to view it. And now we're actually making it easier for folks to publish their own tours and talk about their data and their information through this thing we're calling Layerscape, which is an website that allows us to have community tours created and allow anyone to publish tours about their data and give the story about their data and information. We've also think that there's a key thing with the whole NUI piece, so things like Connect, on how you interact with information and data. And we did this through things like looking at how we could do it with Worldwide Telescope and how you could drive things like Worldwide Telescope through natural user interaction, using gestures, using some of this ways to naturally interact with it. And this becomes more important when we start dealing with large displays. Many people have 60-inch displays in their house. And that's now. What's going to happen in 5 years? Will your whole wall be essentially glass? Will you be having high definition on every single wall in your house or room? How do you interact with that? And so we look at it as how can you do this, and we use Worldwide Telescope as essentially a prototype to play with a lot of these technologies, but make that very easy to do. So one of the things, it's always good to have a little bit of controversy, I guess. But how do we deal with data storage sustainability? So we all think that, yes, data should be accessible, that people should have access to it, scientists, others could have access to it. How do we actually pay for the cost of spinning disks, bandwidth, cooling of those systems? The way we do it with search and some of these others is you actually happen to be giving up something. You're giving up information about yourself and your search habits and others that they're mining to actually find it out. How do we deal with it with other data that may not have that same economic model on it? And how do we deal with keeping this data for 10, 20, 30, 50 years? So what's the right way? We deal with it in different ways in different other infrastructure in different ways. We deal with tolls on highways. We deal with TV licensing in different countries. You pay a license to actually be able to use a TV. And I'm not saying I have an answer in here, but something to think about. How do we start paying for this? And how do you handle it in a way that allows data to live on? And do we allow everyone to store petabytes of every scientific output they've done? Or is it based off of what they've published or other ways? So it's things to kind of think about and discuss. And this is a really good audience and an event and workshop to do that at. So, currently there's no silver bullet for any of these in helping the scientists. We still need algorithms at scale. We got to start having data management from the start. What I mean by that is scientists need to start thinking about that early, not later, after they've collected data. How do we automate some of this ancillary data, which is the piece that actually a lot of times tells about the data so that you can actually interpret it? Every data set has assumptions built into it. The ancillary data should have information about those assumptions so that somebody later on can actually figure it out and and figure out the meaning of your data. Start thinking about data sharing from the start, not afterwards, which is where most of the times it happens. How do I publish it? What's the right metadata? How do I need to do it? We think about, how do we deal with visualizations for everyone? How do you make great visualizations that allow you to communicate information? For folks that like art, if you run across a great piece of artwork, it has a guttural feel to it. You actually feel connected to it in some way. Either you like it or you hate it, but you have a connection to it. How do we do that for scientific information? Because that bridges the gap to that communication side. That's where you get it to policymakers and to the general public. How do we share best practices? Workshops like this is a really good place, but it's a good place if we share not only the successes, but also the challenges and where people need help across disciplines. So when we originally started this, and going back to the SciData workshop, one of the key things we wanted to have was every presentation talk about the challenges that they were facing within their area. So yes, they've had successes, but you know what? I'm still trying to do this. And then somebody else could say, hey, in our domain, we're actually trying this technology, we're trying this algorithm, or we've done it this way. So how do we share that? And there's also these challenges we keep looking at too, which is balancing across data acquisition, how much data, how much storage, the bandwidth, and the overall storage and processing. It's kind of like a three-legged stool, and no matter what on the cost and the processing, they always have to be in balance. You can't have one more than the other. I talked about a lot of these, how do we deal with the cross-discipline collaboration, knowledge sharing, how do we teach new scientists to be data collectors and data archivists? And what we look at, and some of the things I've learned from working with others and Mark Abbott and his folks at Oregon State, is how do you ride the commodity curve on a lot of these technologies? So how do we use things that are coming out of the pure commercialization side, cheap sensors, cheap cameras, and use those, and what can you pull out of those? And the key thing to always keep in mind is also the technology and computing is in support of the science. The science isn't in support of the technology and computing. So how do we make sure that that is always helpful in there, and that the science can actually drive new ways of doing the technology and computing and leveraging it? One thing I want to just highlight is that there's a new session tomorrow afternoon, and we're lucky to have the director for the eScience tools be speaking at the 4:30 session tomorrow afternoon, along with the other two speakers that are listed there. So wanted to make sure people were aware of that as well. It's a late addition to the agenda. So with that, my one real animation there. I want to thank you, and thanks for letting me speak. And if you have any questions, I'd be glad to take those. So thanks. Excellent. No questions.
And in that slide, for that process from raw data to process data, you mentioned an increase of value. I'm not going to argue that. What I'm wondering here is there is another aspect that decreases the value of the processed data, because in the data processing, particularly for scientific data, you apply assumptions, and those assumptions may not be right. What is your vision on that?
So yeah, and that's always going to be the case, right? There's assumptions that are built into any data set and any algorithm that's being used. We, as scientists, computer scientists, usually build on those. We take those assumptions as valid through the algorithms we currently use, and we use those until the point that somebody else comes along with a different one. So that value of the data goes up because it's more accessible and more easy to use. You're absolutely right. It goes down if the assumption or the algorithm itself is wrong. But that's over time, right? It ends up going down at some certain time that it's been deemed that it's not valuable or not valid. So you always need folks working on new algorithms and working against the raw data set, but you don't need every scientist starting from the beginning and using the raw data to do that processing to get there, because they're going to be using whatever algorithms they currently know about, which may not be the best algorithms that are out there. So it's a double-edged sword, but much the way we utilize technologies as they keep going up the curve, as you keep building on the abstractions on those from the computing side, scientists need to be able to use process data earlier on, process data, and not have to go all the way back to the piece. Because even on the raw data, the data that you get from NASA has already been interpreted because the sensors actually at the satellite has already interpreted it based off some algorithm at the CCD. So where do you go back to? And that's the thing that happens. This happens with any sensor. Are you dealing with the voltages, or are you dealing with what they've been interpreted into some sort of characteristic? We infer so much information from many different signals that you always want people really examining those and actually refining those. But much the way you want people writing kernel code or experts writing code down at the assembly leverage, you don't want everyone doing that. So it might answer or not answer, but I actually think that value of the data, once it becomes more standardized, that everyone uses it, then it has a value, because you actually start from there and go forward, and all the data is based off there. And I agree, you should always have people re-examining and redoing new algorithms and retesting those out. But if we have everyone always starting from the raw data, we're just burning cycles. Or grad students.
Yes, thanks. So basically you said that it is important that the data is then made public and published somehow by somebody. Do you have suggestions who this should be? Because this seems like a hot potato that just passed on from one funding agency to the next, and depending on the domain, nobody really feels responsible.
So I do think the data needs to be published. I think we, as a community, as industry, as governments and things, need to also talk about how that can be done in an economic, sustainable manner, right? To think that you're just going to everyone publish every single data, all the data they have from every experiment they have, and you start multiplying that by every single scientist out there and every single experiment, it's going to be even a harder problem, just not only to find the right data sets, but which ones are valid, but to even just find to pay for that cost of spinning disk. One question that I always kind of think about is, and this came up many years ago through NIH when they were looking at their data sets and what their budget, how much money they were spending on supporting current databases that were out there, and how much money wasn't going to new research. And that's one of the things I think we have to start thinking about is, do we keep spending money just to maintain current infrastructure that we have and not actually fund new research? Because at some point the budgets aren't going to keep increasing. So how do we actually balance that? And are there ways to actually decide on what data is held for long term and which ones aren't? One of the things I think about is observational data. If it's 100 years worth of observational data, it's much more worthwhile keeping that than it is to keep an output of a model run that could be recreated. Because you can't recreate what happened 100 years ago. It takes 100 years to capture that data, and we need the historical information. You can always rerun model information data as long as you have that available. So those are things as well. What is the right data sets that we keep, and how valuable are those over time? So I don't have an answer on how it should be done. I think it should be published. But I have my personal views, but I'll share those at some other time. George.
Just a couple of comments to amplify some things that you said. The first one is a profound intellectual paradigm shift that has to do with theory. I mean, we think of theory as analytical theory, and a lot of people naively think of numerical simulations as a crutch that's somehow subsidiary to analytical theory, but this is no longer true, because a lot of complex problems can only be tackled numerically. They don't have analytical solutions. And now, theory is numerical, and the theoretical statement becomes a data set, no longer a formula, but a data set that comes out of complex simulation, which is as big and as complex as the measurements that we now get. So both theory and experiment are data-driven. And both then require us to learn how to extract knowledge from these large and complex data sets. And so in some sense, the third paradigm really becomes part of the fourth. Now, my second comment is that, again, to quote one of many wise things that Jim Gray said, he said that, may all of your problems be technical. And indeed, we can solve technological problems, but sociological ones are difficult. And essentially, old dogs rarely learn new tricks. And this is going to get much worse because we have technology that evolves on Moore's law timescale. So reluctantly, I would say we have to really try to empower younger generations of scientists who will naturally embrace this, digital natives that are growing up to be our successors. But there, academia is doing a lousy job in teaching methodology of computational science because professors don't know this kind of stuff. And I would say this is looming as an ever larger problem, and because academia has a huge inertia, it's not going to get very much better either. So we may want to think, how do we use great powers of information technology to actually provide the subsidiary education that everybody will need and that universities are way too slow to do?
So I won't comment on if it's being taught well or not. I think that one of the things I've seen is that in some of the environmental sciences, there's always been a historical way of teaching how you do collection of information, usually physical information. How do you actually collect that, catalog that, and handle those samples? And one of the things I've been talking to the folks saying is we also need to do the same with digital information data. How do we collect it, maintain it from the beginning? And how do we teach that and incorporate that as well? And so I think there are some of those ways that we need to change, and can we change both the teaching aspect, but also, like you said, getting it to the younger generation from the early on of both that and the sharing. And can we incorporate in more of the social pieces as well? So yeah, I do agree that there's changes that need to happen. I do think, I agree with you that there is inertia based on the way the system is currently set up with publishing and the information data, that it's much easier to hold on to it and mine it until you actually get all the papers out before you publish it out as well as a tough thing to overcome in some of the disciplines. So, yeah. So I think that's it. So I think everyone wants to go for coffee. I think Harold has a couple things to say. Oh, not yet? Okay, Harold's got something to say. So, thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much for this interesting talk. Just want to introduce myself. Please stay here. I'm Evan Lauer. I'm the General Chair of the IEEE eScience Conference, and I'm very happy that this time, the first time, the Microsoft eScience workshop is co-locating with the eScience Conference. So we are up for a very interesting week. And I have a little present for you, which is a typical Swedish Dalarna horse. So that's the craft work that is very typical for Sweden. And I hope you find a nice place for you at home. And so thank you very much.
Thank you.